In for another episode of Battery Power. I'm Cory McCartney along with Grant McAuley. It's the holiday season, but it's also Hall of Fame voting season. And Grant, 5 Braves are on a ballot that is absolutely dripping with controversial figures.
Yeah, there's no shortage of, I guess, storylines, narratives, and debate when it comes to the Hall of Fame ballot pretty much every year. We've seen it get a little bit less crowded when it comes to the rule of 10, which is something I'm sure we'll get into on this particular show. And lots of folks have debated over the years the merits of limiting the ballot to 10. But I think we're starting to get more of a balance of it's looking more like there are 8, 9, 10, 11, maybe 12 guys, as opposed to, hey, there's 16 guys that could be in the Hall of Fame on this ballot, depending on which way you want to go. And how am I supposed to limit myself to 10? That felt like it was a really big thing over the last 5 to 10 years. But just looking at this ballot and the Braves connections, there's none bigger than Andruw Jones. And that's the one that I think everybody would like to see gain some more steam, some more momentum towards his, march towards Cooperstown, which I do think will happen eventually. But then you have to look at some of the other things that aren't so great about this ballot, but could be coming to an end soon. In the names of Bonds and Clemens, Curt Schilling is a totally different case. We'll get into him. And I'm always fascinated by Hall of Fame talk, but it feels like we could spend the rest of the day talking about this, and we're going to try to limit ourselves to responses that may resonate a little bit more with our audience. So I'll leave it at that long diatribe, and then we'll jump into so many more nuances and things when it comes to the Hall of Fame ballot. But Andruw Jones is the guy we're going to be talking about as kind of the headliner, the showstopper, the main event of our show.
Yeah, we'll get into our own personal Hall of Fame ballots shortly. But again, as you mentioned, we're going to run through the Braves candidates. That's Andruw Jones, Billy Wagner, Gary Sheffield, Tim Hudson, and Mark Teixeira. So let's start with Andruw Jones, a name that, frankly, honestly, I'm surprised that we're talking about the level of support that we continue to talk about with a guy with 10 gold gloves. Just barely stayed on the ballot that first year, 7.3% of the vote. He was at 7.5% a year later, 19.4% in 2020, and 33.9% in 2021, the last vote. I mean, it's a long way from that 75% needed. The invaluable Ryan Thibodeau, not Mr. Tibbs on Twitter, currently has Andruw at 50% of the ballots so far. It's important to note, though, that less than 10% of the ballots. So he's going to need a huge groundswell of support, though, if 2022 is going to be the year that Andruw Jones gets that Hall of Fame call. I put this to you, Grant. Why is this not such a clear case for so many voters?
I think that the precipitous drop of Andruw Jones' career, going from a guy that spent a decade being the high water mark of defensive excellence in all of baseball, in my opinion, regardless of what position you were playing, Andruw Jones' name always came up. I think they practically invented the platinum glove with this guy in mind, because that's what kind of impact he made on the game. And if you ask any of the Braves' big 3 starters that got into the Hall of Fame, their Hall of Fame manager, their Hall of Fame GM, the Hall of Fame third baseman that just went in, Andruw Jones is a huge reason why the Braves won the way that they did and were the team that they were for so long. And he's not just some defense first guy. This is somebody with 400 plus career home runs, but it's also a player who, had he taken perhaps better care of himself and not ended up falling off a cliff offensively toward the end of his career and no longer being a starting player and not being able to make a march towards maybe some other important counting numbers that might have strengthened his case, maybe he wins a couple of 3 or 4 more gold gloves on top of that. It just seemed like people are remembering the recency of Andruw Jones and may have let that kind of detract from thinking about, at his peak, what did Andruw Jones do? Well, that's play the outfield better than anybody that I've seen in my lifetime. And I think that is Hall of Fame worthy, especially when you start adding in, this is a guy with 30 plus home run seasons, 40 plus home run season, a 50 plus home run season, could drive in 100 runs and could save you double digit runs in a season as well. This is a guy whose all around game is strong enough, I think, at its peak to be the merits of his case, even if he didn't have the longevity of other players that got 2 decades worth of time in the big leagues. I think that's what people look at, really, is the way that Andruw left the game as opposed to really what he was doing over that decade or so in a Braves uniform when he was so dominant on a team that was winning year in and year out.
I do wonder, though, if you can be so good that you can make things look too easy.
Yep.
Right. Can you be so good that the spectacular plays? I mean, that you and I have talked about that play in Montreal where he just like flies across the screen when you watch it on YouTube many times. Favorite. I mean, obviously those are the spectacular, but you can play. I mean, the fact that he would play so shallow that he would take away those little bloop hits and still have the speed to be able to get back on a ball. I feel like there's a sense of that that he just made it almost look too easy. But I do wonder, though, if recent era committee inductees are going to help him. And obviously, the baseball writers vote is completely different from what you have from the era committee selections. But I think about Harold Baines, a guy that has 50 fewer home runs and a lower OPS than Andruw Jones has. Tony Oliva, and I think this is a real critical one for Andruw Jones. He just got in as the first expansion era player with less than 2,000 hits, and he has 16 less than Andruw Jones has. So I wonder if that, I mean, because you could say, obviously, these are two completely different monsters, the writers, the era committee, but there's still standards of what is a Hall of Famer. And when those standards are changed by help of the guys who are actually in the Hall of Fame, when you think about the makeup of those committees, I wonder if that changes it a little bit. And also our understanding of defensive metrics. I mean, obviously, if we had outs above average and all those, StatCast numbers that we love to pour over when Andruw was changing, how different are things? But okay, 97 to 2007, he had a 26.6 defensive WAR, nearly 10 better than anybody else playing the game during that time period. So I don't know. I just feel like for whatever reason, whether it's, just the fact that he got lumped into these ballots that were really, just stacked, and it was kind of hard to get that exposure that you wanted to give him. I'm having a hard time understanding why we're sitting here this far into the proceedings waiting for Andruw Jones to get the call.
I think the last point that you made is the one that probably has a decent amount of impact on Andrew's early couple of ballots in terms of being under 10%, under 25%, really. And this could be a whole different thing, and maybe this is something for off the air and something to just continue to debate for years and years and years. But I feel like baseball Hall of Fame, the balloting and the system in which was originally set up in order to bring players into the Hall of Fame, elect guys and induct guys, ultimately has failed baseball time and time again in terms of its timeliness and in terms of really, I think, hitting the mark more times than not. Maybe they do, but I feel like there are a lot of misses for this. And I also feel like the game has evolved beyond just the sports writers, the baseball writers being the only, the only body that can really have any kind of final say on this. And that's kind of what that is, which is why those era committees may end up looking more favorably on candidates who've been overlooked, because I think that Oliva's case, it should have been made a long time ago and should have gotten him into the Hall. Same thing for Gil Hodges, certainly the same thing for Buck O'Neil, Minnie Minoso, and many other players who've gone in on an era committee or the Veterans Committee as it was before that. But to bring it all back to Andruw Jones, yes, eventually I think that could be a route for him into the Hall of Fame if he does not get the writer's ballot support, which I think he's got time on his side as of right now. We saw that time can work for Larry Walker and many other candidates who've been able to get over the 75% threshold, as arbitrary as it feels to be when you limit the ballot to a rule of 10. I think Andruw still has a way in there, but it's just going to take a little while longer for people to really start looking at the ballot and maybe warm up to the idea, which sounds ridiculous, because he's not going to play another game in between these years. And that's always something I come back to. His case is his case, regardless of how Harold Baines got in, regardless of how the Eras Committee guys got in. I think Ted Simmons took way too long to get in, but those are completely different discussions for a guy who's still on the writer's ballot. But to bring back to the original point that you made that I think does need to be said time and again for the people in the back, you watched Andruw Jones make it look so easy because he made plays that other guys would have had to dive for. That to me has always been the big difference between Andruw Jones' greatness in the outfield and the greatness of different players who played that position. Specifically, I think of Jim Edmonds, who was a very good center fielder, a very good defender, but not Andruw Jones to me. And that's the eye test, and that's a lot of other things. Now, was Edmonds maybe more consistent offensively than Andruw Jones? Sure, you could make that argument. And maybe Jim Edmonds got a raw deal when it came to his Hall of Fame candidacy too. We're looking at Scott Rowland on this Hall of Fame ballot. We're looking at other guys that have a defensive value component that goes in there. I think it's just harder to quantify because people seem to remember the offensive standout moments and look at the offensive compiling stats and milestones a lot more favorably for hitters than they look at for, hey, was this guy the greatest glove ever? If Andruw Jones could have gone out to center field and done a backflip, maybe that would have changed his Hall of Fame chances because he would have had a signature move that people would remember him for. But he was just a quiet, consistent greatness in the outfield. And I think that is sometimes hard to quantify from an analytic standpoint and harder to explain to the average fan. And maybe that's a little bit of the thinking, is that it's just a little bit too far off the beaten path than, hey, man, this guy hit 500 home runs. He's one of the greatest sluggers ever.
So time is on his side, but a guy that time is ticking away for when we talk about former Braves Billy Wagner, slightly better numbers at this point than Andruw Jones. He's at 53.3% during the current tracker. Wagner was at 31.7% last year, 3 years left on the board. Been a steady climb for him after getting to 10.5% support in his first year. Grant, where do you stand on the case of Billy Wagner?
Billy Wagner's a Hall of Famer to me because I think that you can't necessarily line all the Hall of Famers up beside one another and expect it to all look the same. There are different kinds of Hall of Famers. Not everybody is Hank Aaron or Babe Ruth or Ted Williams or pick a guy. I mean, Sandy Koufax has a different case than Walter Johnson has, than Bob Gibson has, than John Smoltz had. Like, they're not all the same. I think it's a lot of people look at it. I know a Hall of Famer when I see one, but I think it's harder to quantify on the closer side because of how much the game has evolved. And I don't think that Wagner, jumps off the page when put against his contemporaries of other positions during the era in which he played. But his strikeouts per nine, his pure dominance as a late inning reliever, I think, to me, and again, he doesn't have the 500 or 600 saves, but he has 400 plus saves in his career and is more dominant, if I'm looking for a guy to get an out, than even maybe a Trevor Hoffman or a Dennis Eckersley, who was a great closer for his time after being a very good starter for his time and had a hybrid case. But Wagner's just a guy that I think that it takes a little bit more for people to warm up to the idea of, hey, pitchers are people too. Remember that whole thing we talked about with the Braves a couple of years ago when the bullpen was getting just so much flack on social media? But relievers in particular, their case is never going to have the wins above replacement and other things that just stands out to you and makes it seem like they belong. So whether we're talking about Raleigh Fingers or Bruce Sutter or Lee Smith or Mariano Rivera, there have been a lot of great closers, a lot of guys who have been the all-time saves leader, but their value is far beyond just that one stat. But for some reason, it seems to be the one that everybody looks at. And the more guys that join the 300 and 400 save club, I think kind of watered down the value of that particular counting stat or milestone stat that was kind of a differentiator when saves were not as plentiful as they are today.
So you ran through a number of them there, but just to clarify, 8 closers are in the Hall of Fame: Dennis Eckersley, Raleigh Fingers, Goose Gossage, Trevor Hoffman, Mariano Rivera, Lee Smith, Bruce Sutter, and Hoyt Wilhelm. You can argue that Wagner, and you mentioned this, the contemporaries is what hurts him. I think he's 6th on the all-time list, but obviously playing in the same era as the top 2 guys in that list in Hoffman and Rivera hurts. Yeah. But I think you can also make the case there are numbers where he is comparable and to the 2, and if not better in some degree than both of them. Hoffman in particular is a better opponent batting average than both of them. And in the last, I love this, last 121 years among pitchers with at least 900 innings, no one has a higher K per 9 than Billy Wagner at 11.92. I mean, think about the 422 saves, right? 900 innings, but what he did within those 900 innings, I think, is what elevates him. It's not the counting numbers. It's not those, okay, look at where this guy's at on the all-time list. It's clear domination in that era in which you performed and the limit, the time period you were out there. How good were you in those moments? And I think you can easily make that case that Billy Wagner put up those kind of Hall of Fame credential kind of numbers within those innings.
And if Billy Wagner had 500 saves, which is to say, if he decided to pitch another year and maybe pick up those 37 to 40 saves, or if he hadn't gotten hurt the season right before he came to the Braves when he was in Boston, maybe you figure out a way to get him 70, 80 more saves. If he's sitting on 500 saves, I have no idea how he would not fly into Cooperstown with at least 75% of the ballot. And that's where I feel like we start to lose track of things, because we want to say that it's about a certain level of greatness, a certain level of domination, but then there are guys who they dominate for a period of their career, 7, 10, 12 years. And then there's a certain decline that happens to virtually every player where they're still good, but they're not what they once were, but they're able to accumulate some stats that make their overall resume line up a little bit more so with contemporaries of the Hall of Fame. For closers, when you talk about there's 8 guys in there that are in mostly on saves, throw in Eckersley and throw in John Smoltz as guys who are the hybrid candidates, and they certainly count as well. It's hard to get in as a reliever, and I think that that's what Billy Wagner is really facing. Wilhelm was a Veterans Committee guy, and some of these other guys that are going to get in eventually, and I think Wagner may be another one, are going to have to count on the specialized committee voting. I just feel like even with the ballot clearing out a little bit, it's going to be hard for Billy to get all the way to the 75. But one of the most dominant relievers of the time that he pitched, and maybe he just made that same mistake that so many other players have made. Tim Raines played when Ricky Henderson was around. Ted Simmons was playing when Johnny Bench was around. And sometimes I feel like if you're looked at against a player that sets the bar, it's very hard for people to say, oh yeah, but him too, he's also a Hall of Famer. And I think that that's kind of a blind spot for a lot of the voters and perhaps some fans too.
Yeah, and I do wonder as we think about, being more receptive to specialized guys. I mean, obviously David Ortiz is the first time around this ballot. We've seen Edgar Martinez get in as a designated hitter. Certainly there's Frank Thomas. There's more of a willingness now to see guys as, someone who did one thing and did it really well. And you wonder if that's ultimately going to help out when it comes to the case of Billy Wagner. Gary Sheffield, meanwhile, at 40% in the early voting returns, he's been as low as 11.1%. Has 2 years left on the ballot. He's sticking around. Obviously, when you think of Sheffield, it's hard not to bring in those ties to Balco and being in the Mitchell report, having been a blow to his chances. Grant, I think as we watch the cases of Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens in particular, I think those guys are going to wait. Whatever happens to them, they're both in their final year on the ballot. I think whatever happens to them is going to ultimately, we're going to see a similar thing play out with Sheffield in his remaining time on the ballot.
It could, and I think there's no doubt about this, and we don't have to get lost down this rabbit hole, that there are guys that have taken some performance-enhancing substance or drugs and have already made it into the Hall of Fame. I'm just going to leave that right there. Gary Sheffield did not fail a test. Now, his ties to Balco, that certainly is a mark that a lot of people are going to look at and say, well, I can't get behind that. I don't know what this did to augment or change him from a great hitter to a supernatural hitter or whatever you want to say is the case, because that's certainly the case for Barry Bonds, who already played the game like he was from another planet and somehow took something that turned him into baseball's version of Captain Marvel. So I don't know what you do with guys like Sheffield that have that tie that some of the other guys who've gotten in that had the suspicions, which is fair. I mean, this is alleged until something is proven, that they use performance-enhancing drugs. And there's no real good answer for this, and I don't want to waste a whole lot of time talking about it, other than I think you have to measure him against his contemporaries. And I think you have to look at, and I'll get to this later with Clemens and Bonds, you put the commissioner of baseball who was sat and presided over the steroid era into the Hall of Fame. You didn't hold it against him, and I don't know that you can really hold it fully against these players who at the end of the day are going into a museum that celebrates the history of the game. I just think you tell the whole story on the plaques and let people figure it out as you vote. And so maybe that's a spoiler for how we're both going to look at our ballots a little bit later.
Hey, Bud Selig couldn't fill out a T-shirt. I think that was why we held him to a different regard. But when I think of Gary Sheffield, I mean, he's one of 12 players in history with at least 500 home runs, 2,600 hits, and an OPS of 140 or higher. 7 of those guys are in the Hall of Fame. 2 of them are active in Albert Pujols and Miguel Cabrera, and the other 3, Bonds, Alex Rodriguez, and Sheffield, obviously all have the PED label attached. The numbers are there. I just don't know if the support is going to be there. And as we look at guys who are struggling for support, 2 final Braves, I'm going to lump them together, but we'll get into each of them. Tim Hudson and Mark Teixeira. Hudson is in his second year on the ballot, barely stayed on with 5.2% of the votes last year. Remember, you have to get 5% to be able to stay on for another year. Teixeira is in his first year, and currently he has 0 votes. You need, again, 5%. I think both of these guys are in danger of not sticking around. I'm a little surprised you can make cases for either one of them. And certainly, the makeup of the ballot does not help when it comes to the cases of Hudson and Teixeira.
No, it doesn't help. And for Teixeira, it's what did he do so well that it differentiated him from his peers at that time? His career started out ablaze in his 20s, but really started to flame out, and injuries was a huge part of that in his 30s. His tenure with the Yankees, after a very good first season, kind of became this up and down thing to by the time that they were done, they were just happy the contract was over, and Mark Teixeira ended up retiring after that. So I'm not taking it against him. He had a great career, but not every great career ends up in Cooperstown, as we well know. We've got personal favorite players that aren't in there that we feel like should be. I've got guys that I think are of historical relevance that are not in there. And I kind of look at like a Roger Maris in a case like that. But Maris has something to his credit that a guy like a Mark Teixeira does not have. He broke one of baseball's hallowed records. The career numbers don't add up to some of the guys that are already in Cooperstown and the guys that will go into Cooperstown. but I think Roger Maris belongs there. That's a totally different conversation than Mark Teixeira, and Roger Maris never played for the Braves. But I guess what I'm looking for is there something attached to some Hall of Fame cases, whether that's I was the greatest postseason player, the all-time hits leader in the postseason, the whatever it is, the all-time saves leader of the postseason on top of what I did in the regular season, the all-time wins leader. You know what I mean? Like those are the kind of things that October can do a lot for you. And Teixeira certainly doesn't necessarily have that on his side either. In fact, the most noteworthy thing I think he did was help the Angels get Mike Trout. So that probably is not part of his Cooperstown resume. It's just a footnote in a trivia question somewhere that I hope I just helped somebody win. But Tim Hudson to me means a lot more to the Braves, and he's a guy that is going to appear on ballots, I feel like, or should appear on the ballot for longer than just the one and done year. I think he has a stronger case than people realize in terms of his durability. But again, Tim Hudson was not the standout pitcher year in and year out, who was perennially a top 5 Cy Young Award candidate. He was there, I think, a time or two as far as Cy Young votes are concerned. He certainly got some, but he was never in the category or class of a Cy Young runner-up or a Cy Young winner, even the one time that would really do a lot for a case. But I think that consideration on the ballot is important. And for guys that played as long as they did and did as much as I feel like he did for the Braves, he's a guy that earned, at the very least, the courtesy of saying he should stay up here so that we can continue to perhaps debate or at least look at this guy's candidacy before dismissing him altogether. So I think Hudson has a pretty good case. Teixeira, it's just not dissimilar enough from so many hitters we've seen in the last 25 or 30 years to really push him to the top. And I think he might be a one and done candidate, which is unfortunate, but just it's the numbers game.
Yeah, I think with Teixeira, I mean, obviously it's difficult to truly compare players across eras, but I think about Gil Hodges just having gotten in via the era committee. He had 29 more home runs and had a higher WAR, 44.8 to 42.1, and played in 209 fewer games than Gil Hodges did. Certainly, Hodges meant something very different, though, to an era of baseball when you think about the Brooklyn Dodgers and all that.
Right.
And, you know, I think
and the
that
New York
kind of,
Mets.
yeah, obviously the Mets as well. But with Hudson, there's going to come a time where we have to recalibrate what we think a Hall of Fame resume looks like for a pitcher. You know, obviously the 200 innings are becoming less frequent. The 300 game winners we know are not going to be part of the narrative for baseball going forward. So does that ultimately help him? Because he won 222 games and he's one of 17 pitchers who have 220 wins, 2,000 strikeouts, 3,000 innings, and a ERA plus of 120 or better. Every one of them on that list, except for Roger Clemens, is already in the Hall of Fame. So
yeah, I mean, those are the kind of things that we can look at. I feel like we can make a lot of really great qualifier statistics and or lists, if you will, that kind of show guys in a different light. I don't want to say it's a lot of cloak and dagger maneuvering or smoke and mirrors when it comes to trying to prop somebody up. Again, I'm not saying that Tim Hudson was the most dominant pitcher, even on this ballot for the Hall of Fame, let alone last year or the last 25 years, if we want to go back over the course of his career. But I just feel like from a durability and long standing that he had in the league, it means a little bit of something. And if you are looking at things like, you know, the wins plateau, which is something that is a lot of people like, oh, pitcher wins. That's how I know you don't know anything about baseball if you're still pointing at those. I don't necessarily think that's true because I think it's an indicator of when this club was winning, how often was this guy out there? I think that part of it is important. Does it make him a better pitcher because he won more games than Sandy Koufax? No, that's a silly argument, and nobody's making that, but people seem to sometimes jump to that conclusion. But I pulled up a list, and I've got it here, just of WAR for Hall of Famers and the Hall of Fame pitchers that are already in. Now, some of these are going to be relievers, but I think it's important to note that if we're talking about Tim Hudson, who had a WAR of just under 60 for his career, I think it's 57 and change, he's right around guys like Juan Marichal, Don Drysdale, Jim Bunning, Mordecai Three Finger Brown. He's above Whitey Ford, Sandy Koufax, who clearly is a totally different animal, who was done by the time he had his 30th birthday. Jim Cott just got in with a Baseball Reference WAR of 45, and his career longevity and his Gold Gloves are a big reason why he's in the Hall of Fame, and perhaps he should have been a long time ago. So I'm saying I can't look at this era and just say, well, these guys that pitched a long time ago, especially in the early 1900s, and this is where I really get a little bit hot about how we look at players now, is there are some guys in the Hall of Fame that would not be standout players today, while I would measure today's performance by, say, a guy like Tim Hudson as somebody who would have succeeded in any era of baseball. And clearly, as the game has evolved, the players have gotten bigger, better, faster, stronger, all those things. Tim Hudson would have been a pretty dominant pitcher in the early 1900s. So it's not like you can tell me Mordecai Three Finger Brown is going to beat Tim Hudson every time out there. This is the whole argument about, could Adam Ottavino strike out Babe Ruth? I mean, these things have merit, but there's no way to ever find the bottom of the rabbit hole or get off into the weeds arguing about this stuff. So hopefully all of that made sense. But I guess when I look at Tim Hudson in a big picture scenario, he did enough for long enough to be considered for the Hall of Fame for more than a year or two.
Yeah, I agree. It's not about whether you get to Cooperstown, but I think in particular, a guy like Hudson, it's about the longevity factor staying on the ballot. I kind of underscores what he ultimately meant to the game. Mm-hmm. And Grant, before we go any further, let's not forget AJ Pierzynski, the former Braves catcher, also in his first year on the ballot, one of only 10 players in history who spent at least 50% of his games as a catcher and had at least 2,000 hits. Do you think Pierzynski stays on the ballot more than 1 year?
I think it's going to be really tough for him too. And for an average Braves fan, they might remember AJ Pierzynski, but he was playing in Atlanta when they went right into the teeth of that rebuild. And it may have been one of the bright spots early on in that. But for AJ, longevity certainly on his side as a catcher who played nearly 2 decades in the big leagues, had the 2,000 hits, as you mentioned, a 280 career hitter, but a Baseball Reference WAR under 25. And as a catcher, just not the all-around resume that you would think of as a at least good or better defender plus the offense. I think that's what gets you a lot of consideration as a catcher. So again, the numbers game is what it is. I don't think the rule of 10 is what's keeping AJ Pierzynski from moving on here, but a lot of guys have, to get onto this ballot, you have to have stuck around in this game and had yourself a good career. And I think AJ Pierzynski can be happy with that, and he can continue broadcasting baseball games as long as he wants, which is not a bad second career for Pierzynski either.
And this year's Baseball Hall of Fame ballot, just heavy with controversy. The last year of eligibility for Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, and Curt Schilling, the first year for Alex Rodriguez. Grant, as we dive into our own Baseball Hall of Fame ballots, I think it's important that we remember the ground rules. You can only vote for 10 players and no write-ins. And we are not, I repeat, we are not making statements with blank ballots. So Grant, I'll turn it over to you. The floor is yours. Put pen to paper. What does your ballot look like?
Well, this is a ballot that I think is certainly unique. And as you mentioned, there's no shortage of controversy. But as I touched on earlier, and this may rub some people the wrong way, but it's just kind of the way I look at it. If you're going to put the commissioner of baseball for the steroid era into the Hall of Fame, I don't know that you can exact all of the justice against the players that are either suspected to have used steroids during that era and don't have the test, the positive test that really backs up that they broke a rule that was in place at that time. That may be paper thin, flimsy, and that's okay with me because, again, we're talking about a plaque in a museum in a state that I don't live in but love to visit, and I do think these guys are a big part of the history of the game, and we're talking about a guy that has the most home runs of all time. We're talking about perhaps the greatest power pitcher of all time, and that's why Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens both appear on my ballot. I do think, and a lot of people say, hey, these guys were on a Hall of Fame trajectory before any suspicions of steroids were ever mentioned by either of their name. And I think that's true. I think that Roger Clemens probably would have had a much harder time getting to 300 wins or having the longevity without ending up in the position that he was thanks to performance-enhancing drugs. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, Barry Bonds was already perhaps the star of the 1990s. It was him or Ken Griffey Jr. Take your pick. And I think that Bonds had a Hall of Fame career. If for some reason injury had ended his career, say in 1998 or 1999, I think 5 years later, he's getting voted into the Hall of Fame first ballot. Same thing for Roger Clemens. If he never puts on a Blue Jays uniform and his career is ended because of injury, I think that he's voted into the Hall of Fame based on the merit of the years that he had up to that point. But this is not that kind of what if that we are going to do with some other things that have to do with perhaps Barry Bonds. This is, did this guy do enough to belong in the Hall of Fame based on the criteria that we're looking at? I feel like it's a hard time to keep two players like that out. So they're on my ballot. Gary Sheffield is also on my ballot, and David Ortiz, who also has some steroid suspicion around him, but never received a suspension or a positive test, is an easy candidate for me to vote for the very first time. As easy as it can be if you want to just get lost in the morality of the whole thing, which I'm not sure is exactly where we want to be with this voting process, but I digress. Andruw Jones certainly going to get my vote. Jeff Kent's a guy that I think, as far as second baseman is concerned, was pretty darn good offensively speaking, and I think earned a spot in Cooperstown amongst his second base contemporaries. Billy Wagner, you're not going to be surprised that I'm voting for him based on our conversation earlier. Scott Rowland's one of those players that is a lot like Andruw Jones to me. You watched him play for a lengthy period of time. He may not be the greatest when you start lining up all of the third basemen in the history of baseball, but I got news for you. He ain't far off in terms of the top 10 or 12 third basemen career-wise who have played the game of baseball based on wins above replacement. I think the offensive and defensive mixture that Scott Rowland brought made him a great player, and to me, it makes him a Hall of Famer. Curt Schilling may hate it, but I'm going to vote for him based on what he did as a pitcher and not what he's doing as a person or humanitarian lately. We'll just leave that right there. And then I'm going to use my 10th spot on someone else we've already talked about, and that's Tim Hudson. I feel like he deserves to have a little bit more conversation around his career. And if that makes me a homer, then hey, let's go, Huddy. We'll see you on the ballot next year, perhaps, but it could be a hard road for him to get above that 5% mark.
All right, I'm going to go through my 10 guys, pick out, and we're going to have some overlap, but certainly I want to make some comments after I run through mine. So I've got Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, Andruw Jones, Jeff Kent, David Ortiz, Todd Helton, Alex Rodriguez, Gary Sheffield, Curt Schilling, and Billy Wagner. Here's my stance on the PED guys, and I know this one is heavy on PED guys, and honestly, if not for the 10-player limit, I'd probably have Manny Ramirez on there as well. You can pick and choose how you want to tell a story of baseball, kind of like how you were telling. But to me, I mean, it's all about the accolades. You can't tell a story of baseball without the guy that hit more home runs than anyone else. You can't tell a story of baseball without a guy that won 7 Cy Youngs, 354 games, and had over 4,600 strikeouts. Same thing with A-Rod and his nearly 700 home runs, and I'm grabbing Sheffield in that case too. But with Schilling, I mean, I know a lot of people are distancing themselves from him, as you had mentioned, but the credentials are there. I think Ortiz, I mean, this guy's going to get in as a first ballot. I mean, I think obviously, you know, the numbers are there for him. With Jeff Kent, I just don't understand why he's not getting the love. I mean, you mentioned the unprecedented numbers from him at power hitting second baseman. We've already discussed why Andruw and Billy Wagner should be in, but I'm in support of Todd Helton, the first player ever with 35 doubles in 10 straight seasons. This is wild. He's one of only 4 guys with 5 consecutive seasons of hitting 320 or better, with 30 more home runs, 100 more RBIs, and 100 plus runs scored. The other guys in that list are Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth, and Jimmy Foxx. I mean, the numbers are real with him, and I think he's just not getting enough support. I mean, he's kind of an outlier, and obviously, you know, you think about, you know, Larry Walker getting in. Does that amplify him? Have we changed how we look at guys who did most of their damage when they were in Colorado? But you know, certainly, I mean, I'm saying, look, if you're going to go with these PED guys, go all in on them. I don't think you can kind of pick and choose which ones based on, but certainly a guy like Manny Ramirez, who, you know, multiple failed tests, you can say, okay, it's different. You can say it's different with Alex Rodriguez, but I'm painting the picture of baseball. And as you mentioned earlier, I'm going to let people ultimately decide for themselves how they kind of want to, you know, how they want to play that picture in their own minds, or how they want to be able to, you know, discuss that story to others.
And here's the thing about the Hall of Fame voting at the end of the day. It is going to be some sort of a popularity contest. And some guys like David Ortiz are going to have a leg up on a guy like perhaps Alex Rodriguez, who is a little bit of a pariah. Now, both these guys are sitting at the same desk doing the same job these days as far as being broadcasters are concerned. But I just know David Ortiz is just a little bit more endearing than his contemporary Alex Rodriguez. But you know, A-Rod made his money and did his thing, but I just felt like the way that he handled his PED suspension in particular, and all of the suspicions around him, and the degree to which he went to try to cover this whole thing up and deny it, it really rubs you the wrong way. And then when there is a suspension, which there wasn't for Bonds, which there wasn't for Clemens, books have been written about these guys and trying to avoid, you know, the legal ramifications, or perhaps the potential of suspension or any other, you know, fines or suspensions that could be levied, I guess is the way to look at it. Any other discipline that Major League Baseball could have thrown at him. That's what I was looking for. You know, it just makes it a little bit different for me. Manny Ramirez, he was just at this for too many times of getting caught, you know, red-handed, if you want to call it that, or at least getting himself suspended. But a guy that we didn't even mention in all of that is Sammy Sosa. This guy's got 600 home runs, but I'm sure it's not a corked bat that's keeping him out of the Hall of Fame. I'm sure it has more to do with the suspicion of performance-enhancing drugs that has to do with him. So if all of these guys get in, ultimately, I'm okay with that. Again, it's a plaque in a museum, and the museum itself, if you've ever been, and I totally recommend that you go, the Hall of Fame is one of the most amazing places. If you're a baseball fan, it's probably the most amazing place that you can go to touch and feel like you're a part of the history of the game. these guys are already in different displays and exhibits, and they rotate on a pretty regular basis. So it's not like they're being whitewashed. Pete Rose is in the museum. His bats, his jerseys, hats, whatever you may want to see there, it's all in there. But let's not bring Pete Rose into this. We did so well for so long before I ruined it there. But when I look at this ballot and I see all these PED guys, just based on the rule of 10, I had to pick the ones I felt a little more strongly about, or disqualify the ones I felt like clearly knew the rules and chose to ignore them once they were put in place. But this, again, is an arbitrary and very subjective line. And this is just my ballot. And the good news for anybody that hated it out there, it doesn't count.
Well, the real Hall of Fame ballots are due December 31st, and then they wait for those calls from Cooperstown. God help the telemarketer that rings these candidates the day of, asking about extending their warranty in their vehicle. I'm imagining that would be hell to pay if you make those phone calls on that day. So I want to wish everyone a happy holiday and say thank you for coming along the ride with us here on Battery Power. We do truly appreciate it. Help spread the word. Make sure you tell your friends to subscribe to the Talking Chop YouTube channel. Get them to like, get them to turn on notifications so they get an alert every time that we drop a new episode. Thank you for watching. I'm Cory McCartney. He's Grant McAuley, and we'll see you in next time, Braves Country.